Of course there's a lot of misery, but it is the same misery that is all around us. The trees here are in misery and the birds are in misery. I don't think they sing, they just screech in pain.
This is German director Werner Herzog.
I know what Facebook is all about.
Werner Herzog is an interesting case. Despite being touted as one of the most important film directors alive and having a massive filmography that spans over 70 films, I bet most people who know of him can't even name 2. Because Werner Herzog is a Hollywood icon in his own right, instantly recognizable by his distinctive face, his voice, and his trademark optimism.
I believe the common denominator of the universe is not harmony, but chaos, hostility, and murder.
But before he cameoed in Rick and Morty and got his own action figure, Werner Herzog was a pioneering figure in the new German cinema movement, making semi-obscure art films for years before moving to Los Angeles and getting hooked up to the Hollywood circuit. Though there is at least one thing that clearly separates director Werner Herzog from the rest of Hollywood, which is, at least according to himself, sanity.
When you look at Hollywood, I mean, it's completely crazed, and I see myself as the only one, literally the only one who is clinically sane.
I'm telling you, he cannot state this point enough.
In a way.
Well, I'm clinically sane, so to speak.
I'm quite sane, clinically sane, so to speak.
I'm the only one who is clinically sane.
Now, I'm not saying that I don't believe him when he says this. I'm just saying that if you look into it, there seems to be a lot of evidence that contradicts him. Like the time he pulled a 300-ton steamship up and over a mountain using Stone Age engineering.
An object of that size and of that weight in one single piece has never been moved over a mountain.
Or the time he hypnotized all the actors for his movie.
All the actors in the film acted under hypnosis. It was not a circus gimmick.
Or his so-called rogue film school, where he teaches his students how to pick locks and forge filming permits.
You see, a film like Fitzcarraldo would never have been possible without massive forgery.
Or the time he got a diagnosed psychopath to play the villain in his movie, started fighting with him daily to the point where they were plotting to murder each other, then kept doing films with him. The stories never stop. I don't think there's any other film director whose life has been mythologized as much as Werner Herzog's. And of course, Werner himself deserves a good bit of the blame for that.
You see, deep in my heart, I'm a wild storyteller.
As of recording this, Werner is 82 years old and firmly in his legacy building phase. In 2022, he released his memoirs, gloriously titled Every Man for Himself and God Against All, releasing alongside a feature-length documentary titled Werner Herzog, Radical Dreamer.
That's me. That's my landscape.
It's a good watch, though the fundamental problem with it is that condensing the life and works of Werner Herzog into a neat 100-minute package is literally impossible. Believe me, I've tried. This video is feature-length too, and it gets, being generous here, a third of the way through his filmography. Yes, I've had to split this video into multiple parts. Only way I'm ever gonna get through this without gnawing all my fingers off. Now, this video is not going to be a 100% comprehensive deep dive into the works of Werner Herzog, though I will cover most of the films he's done. Werner has made, on average, like 1.2 films a year for the past 60 years, and while he is remarkably consistent, there's bound to be a few where I have genuinely nothing to say. Apologies in advance to all the Woodcarver Steiner fans, but ultimately this video is going to be less analysis and review and more of a deep dive into Werner Herzog the man, and the blood, sweat, and tears that he has spent over the last 6 decades to bring his visions to life. So without further ado, here is the crazy life of the last soldier of cinema, the one and only Werner Herzog.
More than 1,000 of our planes have bombed Berlin and the Hamburg and Kiel areas of Germany. In the east, the Red Army's campaigns against East Prussia and Warsaw are entering the last stage.
Werner Herzog was born in Munich, Germany in 1942. Safe to say, he picked a bad time. World War II was in full swing, and Munich especially became the prime target for Allied bombing raids.
And when I was only 2 weeks old, the building where we lived was very badly damaged by carpet bombing, and everything around us was destroyed. And my mother found me in my cradle under a layer of a foot thick of glass shards and debris, but I was completely unhurt.
Being absolutely terrified by this near miss, his mother fled with baby Werner to the Bavarian countryside, to the mountain village of Sachrang. In comparison to Munich, life in Sachrang was incredibly primitive. There was no electricity, no telephone lines, and no running water.
Because we didn't have running water, you had to go out to the well with a bucket and bring in water. We had no sewage system. You see, we had to pour out the bucket outside.
Hopefully not the same bucket. But Sachrang provided something very important: isolation. It was one of the few pockets of Germany virtually untouched by the Nazi occupation, and young Werner only caught brief glimpses of the war that was unfolding around him.
It's my first memory. My mother rips my older brother and me out of our beds and climbs up on the slope right behind the house. And she says, "Boys, I took you out because you must see this. The city of Rosenheim is burning." And the city of Rosenheim is something like 40 kilometers away.
Growing up in the ashes of World War II meant growing up without fathers and without money. Still, Werner recounts his childhood quite fondly.
We grew up without presence of fathers, which was very pleasant. There was some sort of the best of anarchy. We had to take care of ourselves. We made our own rules.
The only thing he remembers lamenting was the constant hunger.
My mother had a loaf of bread for 1 week, and we were hungry. It was not enough. By Friday, normally we had eaten everything. Saturdays, Sundays were bitter.
Life in Sachrang was marked by scarcity. It was a constant struggle to try and make the best out of what little you had. Comfort in any shape or form was a luxury.
For example, we didn't have mattresses. My mother stuffed burlap sacks with hay that she made from fern. But when you cut the stem of a fern, it hardens when it dries. You would feel it at night when you shift it around. All of a sudden, you were on 2 pencils. It was stinging you. And
Werner describes himself as being a strange child. He generally preferred to keep to himself, and when he did spend time with other kids, he would often have fits of violence, striking the other kids with rocks. Though this mean streak came to a head after an argument with his brother over their pet hamster escalated into violence.
I was so beside myself with fury, I laid into my brother with a knife. I struck him once in the wrist as he tried to fend me off, and once in the upper thigh. In no time, the room was awash with blood. I was deeply shaken at my own behavior. Instantly, I understood that I would have to change my ways immediately and profoundly.
With his father being mostly out of the picture and his mother struggling to find work in the countryside, Werner ended up moving back to Munich at age 11. And by complete coincidence, he ends up sharing a house with a certain no-name stage actor.
Nein, hat nicht gesagt, halt die Schnauze. Hat eine Peitsche genommen und hat ihm in die Fresse gehauen.
Klaus Kinski is going to show up a lot during this video, but for now, he is just Werner's neighbor, and he is a menace. Prior to living in the boarding house, the 26-year-old Kinski lived alone in a dilapidated loft with no food and no furniture. The floor was completely covered knee-high in dead leaves, which he would wade through stark naked. He claimed this helped him get closer to nature. According to Werner, the lady who ran the boarding house had a soft spot for starving artists and rescued Kinski from the leaf loft and took him into the house for free.
This lady picked him up from this attic and gave him a room for free, gave him food and did his laundry and everything. And from the very first day, this man terrorized everyone in this apartment.
And Kinski had locked himself in this bathroom for 2 days and 2 nights, for 48 hours. And in his fits of maniacal fury, he smashed everything to smithereens. The bathtub, the toilet bowl, everything. You could sift it through a tennis racket.
Kinski exhausted his hospitality very quickly, and after just 3 months, he was out on the street. One of the upsides to living in Munich over the Bavarian countryside was that, for the first time, Werner had regular access to films.
I started to watch cheap B-pictures, Tarzan, Dr. Fu Manchu, and I noticed in one film that a bad guy who was shot out from a rock and somersaulting down appears a second time 20 minutes later in another battle. And I saw that it was recycled. And all my friends said, no, this cannot be recycled because he was shot dead. A dead man cannot climb up on this on this rock again.
This experience really cemented the idea of film as a constructed visual narrative. That movies weren't just filmed reality, they were creative works. Behind every film there is a person, a filmmaker, with stories to tell and images that they're trying to create. And Werner immediately understood that he was going to be that person. So he starts writing screenplays and contacting local film companies looking for a way in. But Werner is 16 at this point, and puberty is taking its sweet time to kick in properly. He looks like a child and they all laugh him out of the office. So Werner figures that if he really wants to make films, he's got to do it himself. So he goes to the predecessor of what would become the Munich Film School and asks to borrow a camera.
And they had cameras that they would hand out for a few days to aspiring filmmakers. They never gave me one of those.
But then, mysteriously, one of their cameras suddenly disappeared.
It's not unethical if you steal a camera. If you are managing to disguise yourself as a camera repairman and you take the best of them and you use it for making a film, fine.
After stealing the camera from the Munich Film School...
I wouldn't say steal. I have stolen once in a while, but more expropriation than stealing.
Oh, my mistake, Werner. After expropriating the camera from the Munich Film School, Werner starts working night shifts to make money for his first picture.
I rolled up my sleeves and I worked the night shift in a steel factory as a welder. During the day I was in school, but I earned money for making my films and I became my own film producer.
It was hard work, but it meant that at age 19, Werner could finally make his first proper short film, Heracles. Heracles is Herzog's debut onto the silver screen, and it's an odd one at that. Unlike almost every other Herzog production, Heracles is a montage film, relying heavily on pre-existing footage. The film is about the juxtaposition of modern-day bodybuilders to the myth of Hercules. The movie follows a simple loop. First, there will be a montage of bodybuilders building their bodies, followed by one of the Herculean labors in form of a question, which then gets interspersed with a contemporary interpretation of said labor. For example, one of the labors, will he resist the Stymphalian birds, is followed by clips of bomber planes in the sky. Birds, bomber planes, you get it. Right from the beginning, Herzog isn't pulling any punches. At one point, the film uses footage from a real rally wreck where people are being rescued out of piles of real dead bodies, and then 30 seconds later, there's a guy flexing his pecs like he's Super Macho Man. The contrast is on purpose, I'm sure, but it is very jarring. Heracles was shown at various festivals, but did not make much of a splash, and to this day, it's one of the few films he has made that Werner actively dislikes. I've never learned from good films, only from bad ones. I learned immediately, in the most radical ways, from the first embarrassment, and that was Heracles. Werner's next film wouldn't fare much better.
I made a film, Game in the Sand, about children who play with a rooster and dig him into a pile of sand up to its neck. And it's a very, very disturbing film. It is so disturbing that I decided I would never publish it.
Game in the Sand is a mystery. First of all, it's entirely unreleased. According to Werner, it's only been seen by about 3 or 4 people, and he has no intentions of showing it to anyone else, suggesting that he might even destroy the film negatives before he dies. Werner has been very secretive about what makes the film so worth hiding. From the little he has let slip, we know it was filmed in the Burgenland province in southeast Austria. It's about 14 minutes long, and it was apparently made to explore how violence emerges from a playful situation. The film involves a rooster in a cardboard box and 4 young boys. At some point, the rooster ends up being buried in the sand, with only its head sticking out. As for what happened next, Werner only has this to say. During shooting, I had the feeling that things were moving out of control. The boys involved in the filming became violent, and I did nothing to stop them. When I look back, the film should probably not have been made at all. He later claims that this film was crucial for codifying his ethical boundaries as a filmmaker. The image of the rooster being buried in the sand would later be used for his first full-length movie, Signs of Life, a movie for which Werner had just finished writing the screenplay for. He submitted the screenplay to the Karl Mayer Awards, which he handily won, running off with a grand prize of 10,000 Deutschmarks. Offers came pouring in from producers who wanted to buy the screenplay off of him, but Werner refused them all. He was going to direct the film himself, but he was still quite young, and people did not take him seriously.
And then I applied, and that was a great advantage of the new German cinema, of this new wave of young filmmakers. We created our own subsidy system, and I applied for a grant from them, and they denied it because I was only 22.
So since he can't start making films yet, he decides to apply for a scholarship to study film in the United States.
And I had a scholarship, and I said, I want to go to Pittsburgh because it's a town of the steelworkers, but it was already the beginning of the Rust Belt. The school was not really good. Let's not name it, but it wasn't good.
Werner ends up studying film at the Sane University. There he stays for a whole 3 days before bailing. Instead, he starts doing random odd jobs to pass the time, eventually ending up finding work making films for NASA.
The earliest serious practical sort of thing I ever did was for NASA. There was a project, a documentary, a series of documentaries on advanced futuristic propulsion systems that NASA was into.
Though when it comes time to do the background checks, they discover that the weird new German kid is on a Pittsburgh student visa making films in Cleveland, Ohio.
I lost my status as an exchange student and started to work, which I was not supposed to do. Immigration got wind of it and they summoned me, and I knew I was going to be extradited. I was going to be shipped back to my country of origin.
But Werner is not ready to go back to Germany yet, so he hops the border to Mexico, where he starts working as a rodeo clown.
Each Saturday I worked at rodeos, at charreadas, as a rider on bulls, and I can't even ride a horse. So I was some sort of the clown for the audience.
There he gets the nickname El Alamein, named after the biggest German military defeat in World War II after Stalingrad. Because his whole shtick as a rodeo clown was being incompetent, Werner ended up getting injured almost every time he went out in the ring. And after a particularly nasty accident, he decides to quit before he wrecks his body entirely. Instead, he starts making money by smuggling items from the US to Mexico.
They had day laborers from Mexico who would cross in the morning and return in the evening, and they had a sticker in their windshield, and I got one of these stickers. You were waved through summarily. They didn't even look at you. So I brought some stereo equipment for rich rancheros, which was smuggled them in.
He starts smuggling TVs, hi-fi equipment, and even guns at one point. After doing that for a while, he starts venturing further south in the continent towards Guatemala, because, in his own words,
I was obsessed with a vague idea that I would help form an independent Mayan state in Petén.
In the end, he never made it that far. He gets sick with hepatitis before crossing the Guatemalan border and goes back home to Germany. After recovering, he applies for a film grant a third time, and finally, he gets funding.
Finally, the Kuratorium Junger Deutscher Film, Young German Film, subsidized it and some other sources, and so I got it all together.
So in 1967, Werner finally started work on his first feature film, Signs of Life. Signs of Life is about 3 German soldiers who, after sustaining injuries during the ongoing World War II, end up stationed at a scenic Greek island. Life is good, if a bit mundane, but as time goes on, one of them, Private Stroszek, slowly starts to lose his mind. The very first thing you see in this movie is a near-static 3-minute shot of the island of Crete, and it's here we get introduced to one of Werner Herzog's most important facets of filmmaking, the landscapes.
All of a sudden, this drama of an inner landscape takes shape. And it's not just a backdrop as, for example, commercials would use it or Hollywood films would use it. It's an inner landscape, something, a quality of our soul.
For Werner, the landscapes you see in his movies aren't just backdrops for the action to occur. They are, as much as anything else, symbols of deeper human emotions and experiences. They're the well from which almost all of Herzog's films spring from.
Quite often it happens that I spot a landscape that fascinates me for its stylization, for its otherworldliness, for whatever. And all of a sudden the landscapes, this void fills with a story. And it attracts faces, characters, dialogues, dramas. I'm good with landscapes.
Signs of Life would kickstart a career-long tradition for Werner, namely on-set production disasters. The trouble started immediately. Right before they were supposed to start filming, the country of Greece was subject to a coup d'etat, and all their filming permits became invalid overnight. Not only did that cause a substantial delay in production, but it also meant that even when the permits were eventually restored, they were constantly fighting government red tape. The fireworks scene in particular gave Werner a lot of trouble.
And a military, a major who was in command of the garrison in Kos said to me, "We will arrest you if you do this firework." And I said, "I will be there tomorrow and I will do the firework. And the first one who tries to arrest me will be dead together with me."
This is the first time Werner threatens to murder a guy over a scene in his film. It won't be the last. Werner didn't actually have a gun on him, but lucky for him, the soldiers didn't call his bluff. But that wasn't the end of their trouble. Peter Brogel, the actor who played Stroszek, broke his heel bone midway through shooting, leaving him out of commission for 5 months. When he returned, he wore a big, bulky brace and could only walk for a couple of meters at a time, so a lot of the scenes had to be retooled to allow him to perform sitting down. And if he had to walk, he could only be filmed from the hip up.
Now here he's walking with his walking device, so I could film him only from the hip upwards, and we could do only 10 steps or so, and he keeps stumbling and is having difficulties.
Signs of Life was released in 1968 to a resounding, and it went generally unnoticed by the German public for years. The critics, however, were quite fond of it, and the movie ended up winning the annual Bundesfilmpreis in West Germany, which secured him the money for his next film. But maybe most importantly, the film ended up in the lap of German film veteran Lotte Eisner.
But when I saw your Sign of Life, I said, that's a real German film, and that's something for me.
Lotte would serve as Werner's mentor as he learned the ropes of filmmaking. After Signs of Life, Werner would go on to do a bunch of shorter films. One of those films, The Flying Doctors of East Africa, was made to raise money for the medical organization of the same name.
The Flying Doctor Service always has planes ready for any emergency. At the moment, there are 7. The flight takes 2 hours. With a cross-country vehicle, it would take more than a day.
Werner considers this movie more of a report than an art piece, though it was successful in raising the money he needed. But Werner didn't go all the way to East Africa just to film this movie. In fact, he was traveling all across the East African coast looking for someone. Field Marshal John Okello.
By what means was Field Marshal Okello chosen as the leader of the Revolutionary Army?
Because of his experience and the leadership which is popular to the people who organize it.
Alright, let me give you some background here. After being a British colony for over 70 years, the island of Zanzibar was granted its independence in December 1963. That lasted for all of 1 month before the Arab-led government was overthrown by a local resistance group. The man who spearheaded this revolution was John Okello. In January 1964, Okello and his men seized control of the entire island of Zanzibar, including the radio tower that had been operated by the BBC. John Okello would use this to his advantage, broadcasting sinister declarations across the East African coast.
I seem to remember reports of his circling over the island in a small plane, transmitting his radio broadcasts. Anyone who steals a bar of soap or who eats 1 grain of rice too much will be thrown into prison for 150 years.
Eventually, the other people in the party leadership found Okello too violent and unpredictable to keep around, and he was ousted from Zanzibar just 1 month after the takeover. He then traveled around East Africa, trying to overthrow other African colony states and getting arrested numerous times in the process. As Werner went looking for him, he took the opportunity to take some shots of the landscape, and it's these shots that would eventually become the movie Fata Morgana. Fata Morgana is the Italian term for mirage. While mirages are often mistaken for hallucinations, they are actually a specific form of optical illusion caused by atmospheric conditions, where distant objects or scenes appear distorted or displaced. Because they are an optical illusion, they can be captured on camera, and, in a way, that is exactly what Werner sets out to do in Fata Morgana, both literally and metaphorically. Every shot in this film feels unreal, almost dreamlike, like it's on a completely different planet. It's a film where the landscapes take center stage. There's no plot, no real characters. This is the artiest of art cinema, and I am not at all qualified to dissect it. The film starts with 8 functionally identical shots of planes landing. As Werner puts it, if you're still with the movie by the 6th or 7th plane, this is probably the movie for you. But Werner went through a lot of trouble to capture these images. First of all, filming in the middle of the Saharan desert is not great. The raw film stock kept melting in the heat, and the camera was constantly being filled with sand, which took days to properly clean out. But most of all, Central Africa in the 1960s was just not a stable place politically. Werner and the gang are traveling in a beat-down Volkswagen, dodging civil wars and coups left and right, and they make the almost fatal mistake of driving through Cameroon.
The small crew that I had and I were mistaken for mercenaries in Cameroon and the Central African Republic, and what happened was there was a military coup d'etat, and in this coup d'etat some white mercenaries were involved, and they believed they had caught the guys who were condemned to death in absentia.
The jail cell was repulsive beyond description. Just less than 20 feet square, it was packed with Africans, even before the Germans were shoved in. In the middle of the awful cell was a stinking bucket into which the prisoners defecated. Herzog said that whenever one of the black men squatted over it, the other men laughed and sang vulgar songs to humiliate him, but when one of the white men squatted over the bucket, there was nothing but silence. It's worth adding that the prison cell was so packed there was no place to sit. Everyone in that cell was forced to stand at all times. While he was incarcerated, he contracted both malaria and bilharzia, a blood parasite, making him so sick that he couldn't even walk. Eventually, someone noticed that they had arrested the wrong guy, that Werner and his film crew weren't the mercenaries they were looking for, and released them. But no one cancelled the actual warrant, so they just kept getting arrested as they traveled through Cameroon. Sometimes they would be assaulted by armed militias pointing guns at them, demanding to know who they were and what they were doing there. Thankfully, Cameroon is a former French colony, and Werner speaks fluent French.
I do understand French, but I refuse to speak it. It's the last thing I would ever do. You can only get some French out of me with a gun pointed at my head. Then I would speak French. It actually happened to me. I was taken prisoner in Africa, and drunk soldiers on a truck, all of them 15, 16 years old, some of them 8, 9 years old, and I mean really scared. One pointing a gun here, a Kalashnikov, another one here and another one there. And I tried to explain that they probably arrested the wrong ones, and the captain of them shouts at me, "On nous parle français ici." Here we are speaking French, so I had to say a few things in French. I regret it.
Now this clip is from a mockumentary called The Incident at Loch Ness, but he has told nearly the exact same stories in other interviews, so it's probably real. Werner legitimately hates French. He says it's too ironic for his mechanical German brain to comprehend.
Because irony always means seeing some sentence that is said to you with a different, separate layer of meaning. And that's what gives me my problem with the French language.
After being arrested multiple times, Werner and the crew finally limped over to the Central African Republic, where they could safely leave for Germany.
This was a film where I ultimately probably lost all fear being prisoner in Africa is so unpleasant and so tough that having gone through that, you are not afraid anymore.
Werner never got to meet John Okello, but they did find some of his relatives living in Uganda. From there, Werner managed to get in contact with the man himself. Werner wanted John Okello to star in his upcoming movie about a Spanish conquistador looking for the city of El Dorado, but this never came to pass. John Okello was last seen with Idi Amin in 1971. After that, he disappeared without a trace. Werner would shoot the final scenes for Fata Morgana on the Spanish island of Lanzarote. He had originally come to the island to shoot his next feature film, Even Dwarfs Started Small, shooting the remaining parts of Fata Morgana in his spare time. But the former is probably more well known, as it is perhaps the wildest and most controversial film Werner has ever made.
Even Dwarfs Started Small. Absolutely wild film, completely unruly.
He's not kidding. Even Dwarfs Started Small feels like huffing diesel fumes for 90 minutes straight. Watching it, I found myself completely stun-locked, like a deer in headlights. There's barely any plot, nothing really happens, it's just a downward spiral into chaos. The movie takes place in an unknown institution. A riot has just broken out among the inmates, who proceed to absolutely tear the place up. Now, it's not, as you may assume, an institution for people with dwarfism. Instead, it's a world where everyone has dwarfism. The institution director, the mugshot photographer, the random woman whose car breaks down. For whatever reason, that's just how people are in this movie. Unsurprisingly, this is Werner's most controversial film. For many reasons. Let's start with the mildest one. The safety precautions on set. There weren't many. Like, there's a scene where they put a brick on the gas pedal of a car and just let it drive around and around in a circle. And when filming this scene, this guy was straight up run over. He was fine though.
And the same little guy caught fire when we watered the flower pots with gasoline and set them afire. He caught fire and I extinguished him with my body. I threw myself on him, and when he was extinguished, I told him, I'm gonna jump into a cactus if you all survive.
I haven't been able to track down any recorded evidence of Werner jumping into the cactus patch, but it's probably true. But the safety of the set is just a footnote, really. The movie is also pretty notorious for its animal abuse allegations. If you're watching this anywhere but Patreon, you're gonna have to take my word for a lot of this, but yeah, there are a lot of unusual shots of animals in this movie. You have scenes like the chicken cannibalizing another chicken, and a group of piglets suckling on the teats of their dying mother, which are certainly edgy, but you could argue that's just nature taking its course. What probably got the most attention is the scene where they crucify a monkey. The animal rights people, for example, were furious at the scene where the monkey was tied to the cross and paraded about, even though it was tied down with very soft wool. I don't think it's the material of the restraints that's the problem here, Werner. This is gonna come up again throughout the video, but Werner has a tendency to treat animals as props in his films. The monkey on the cross being the prime example, but there are a lot of other ones too. For Agire, the Wrath of God, he claims to have experimented on pigs to try and produce symptoms of altitude sickness.
And hundreds of pigs. And the pigs were supposed to be somehow swaying and drop over and so, and we tested certain medications that would make them unconscious, but it just didn't function. It was...
Now, I'm not necessarily gonna defend him here, but I will say this. Obviously, Werner has a view on nature that is very unromantic.
Taking a close look at what's around us, there is some sort of a harmony. It is the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder.
And that view of nature isn't just him being edgy, it's a view of nature that has been informed by years of spending time in nature and witnessing a lot of the cruelty that takes place. Here's a section from one of his journals to further my point. A yellow-spotted kitten was lying outside in the dirt, dying. I could tell immediately from the way it was lying on its stomach, its hind paws stretched out. Bubbles of foam were bursting around its mouth, and it was racked by convulsions. When I moved away, the mother cat came and licked the kitten for a while, but then wandered off. Chickens came and began to eat the kitten, which was still alive, but soon let it be. A duckling came over, peeping, but at that point the kitten had almost stopped moving. So I think in Werner's mind, tying down a monkey for a few minutes then letting him go is nothing compared to what happens in the animal kingdom every single day. That being said though, he also stages like an actual cockfight in this movie, so I don't know, maybe he just doesn't care. The biggest controversy though, especially at the time, was the accusation that the film is making fun of disabled people.
Nach spätestens 2 Tagen hat uns die Polizei. Ja, dann machen wir hier mal Rabatz. Polizei.
The release of the film coincided with the height of the student riots in the late 60s, which Werner has made no qualms about being against.
And I had the feeling this was kind of silly because they all were raving and ranting about liberating the working class. And I asked, has anyone of you ever worked in a factory? No, of course not, but I had worked in a factory.
According to Werner, one of the main criticisms at the time was that the characters in the movie were interpreted to be stand-ins for the student protesters of the day, as a way to depict them as small and insignificant. Now, I disagree with that, as this is clearly a world where everyone has dwarfism, not just the people rebelling. But that begs the question of why use actors with dwarfism at all? In conversations with Paul Ronan, Werner's explanation is that they represent the fact that, quote, we all have something dwarfish, inadequate, impotent, and insignificant inside us, and that a very real nightmare for some people is knowing that deep down, they are a dwarf. Now, I think this explanation is kinda lame. Having characters with dwarfism to represent the metaphorical inner dwarf that exists in all people doesn't really make any sense, considering that people with dwarfism are also people who also experience feelings of inadequacy, impotence, and insignificance. Do they also have an inner dwarf? An even smaller inner dwarf? Me personally, I think even Werner himself isn't entirely cognizant of the reason for making all the characters dwarfs. Every time he talks about it, he seems to be analyzing it as much as everyone else is. The movie is entirely built around it though. Almost every scene is shot at eye level with the characters, but all the objects and environments are normal sized. Even though every person in this movie has some form of dwarfism, there are zero accommodations anywhere. It makes the whole world feel not to scale and distorted, and I think that's closer to what Werner was going for. He has an alternate explanation of what the dwarfs are supposed to represent that seems to be closer to that.
A deep fear in our deepest existence, that we are little in comparison to the objects that we have acquired, and our world is made of things that are too large for us, and we can't handle the physical world anymore, the world of property. Our property has outgrown us. And
ultimately though, whether or not even dwarfs started small is exploitative of little people is a question that far surpasses the scope of this essay. There are gonna be those who see the movie as nothing more than one big sideshow exhibit, and while I don't think that's what Werner was going for at all, I would be lying if I said I didn't see at least traces of that. Like in this scene, which didn't even make it into the film. Years ago, I was searching for the biggest rooster I could find and heard about a guy in Petaluma, California who had owned a rooster called Weirdo that weighed 30 pounds. Sadly, Weirdo had passed away, but his offspring were alive, and guess what? They were even bigger. I went out there and found Ralph, son of Weirdo, who weighed an amazing 32 pounds. Then I found Frank, a special breed of miniature horse that stood less than 2 feet high. I told Frank's owner that I wanted to film Ralph chasing Frank with a dwarf riding him around the biggest sequoia tree in the world. And what am I reading?
The owner wouldn't give the horse to me because he thought his horse would look ridiculous. Wouldn't give it to me.
Ultimately, despite the controversies, Even Dwarfs Started Small has ended up a cult favorite, being one of the favorite films of both David Lynch and Harmony Korine.
Werner has a really good sense of humor. He doesn't, famously has no understanding of irony. So he takes everything completely literal. I used to call him up all the time on his phone in the 90s, and I would pretend to be a rug salesman. He would sit on the phone with me 20-30 minutes thinking I was a rug salesman. I'd sell him 4 or 5 different rugs.
But for his next movie, Werner would do a complete 180. Handicapped Future is a documentary on the treatment of disabled people in West Germany. Like his earlier movie, The Flying Doctors of East Africa, Werner treats this more like a document than cinema, and he plays it uncharacteristically straight. It's still emotionally effective. Having a little girl in a wheelchair talk about how much she dreams about going up the stairs by herself is an easy gut punch. On the whole, though, Werner doesn't really like this one. It's too polite and totally conventional. Today I probably wouldn't even make it, and if I did, then I'd be pushing much harder, without mercy, no longer shying away from a certain truth. But during the filming of this movie, he attends a speech given by the then president of West Germany, Gustav Heinemann. And in the audience, he spots a woman who is getting the speech transcribed to her by an interpreter, who is communicating to her through a series of touches and strokes to her hand. That woman's name was Finny Straubinger, and she would prove to be the catalyst of another movie entirely. Finny Straubinger became deaf and blind as a teenager after falling down a flight of stairs. The now 56-year-old Finny is an outspoken deaf-blind advocate, fighting for their rights in her country of West Germany and helping others in a similar situation. Finny is the central figure the movie revolves around, and in typical Werner Herzog fashion, they follow her around everywhere, especially in places they were strictly forbidden to film, like in the asylum. This is filmmaking stripped to its barest parts. The film crew consists of only 2 people, Werner and the cinematographer, and they barely shoot any footage at all. In total, they only shot 3 hours of footage for a 90-minute feature film, and yet the movie never feels compromised. Land of Silence and Darkness is a film about loneliness. It's about how our senses keep us tethered to the world and how losing them affects our ability to form connections with other people and create a purpose in life, and how despite that, it's still possible and still worth doing. Werner has for many years insisted that while he is a filmmaker and a writer, he is first and foremost a poet. And I think one of the most important jobs of the poet is to illuminate the hidden beauty in places that people often overlook. With that in mind, I think Land of Silence and Darkness is one of the most effective pieces of poetry I've seen in a long time. Right now, it's watchable in full on YouTube. It's 1.5 hours long, it's a slow boil, and it's fucking great. Probably my favorite Werner Herzog film. From doing these low-budget documentaries, Werner had just about scrunched up enough money to finance his next film. This time, he was going all out. He was going to make a historical epic set in the real jungles of Peru. While staying at a friend's house, Werner finds a children's book about famous explorers. He flicks through it out of boredom, and sandwiched between pages on Alexander the Great and Christopher Columbus, he spots a single small paragraph about a Spanish conquistador named Lope de Aguirre. In 1560, Aguirre joined an expedition to find the golden city of El Dorado in the New World. At some point, he led a rebellion against the expedition leader, killed him, and took command of the expedition himself. He then declared himself an enemy of the Spanish crown, calling himself the Wrath of God. This story struck a nerve with Werner, and he figured he had to do something with it. At the time, he was playing with a 5th Division soccer team, and on the bus between games, he would lug around his big, bulky typewriter along with him to write the first draft of the screenplay.
I wrote the screenplay under very difficult conditions because at that time I played a lot of soccer and we had a team, 5th Division team. The entire team was on this bus, and as we had loaded a lot of beer on the bus, everybody after an hour and a half or 2 hours was totally drunk. The screenplay was written in 2.5 days during this excursion, all with my left hand, because with my right I had to ward off our goalie, a very tall guy, but he was so drunk and he was leaning into me and trying to read, and then finally he vomited over my typewriter.
Werner's way of writing screenplays is actually quite interesting. He writes them ridiculously fast and never writes more than one draft. He is, however, very flexible, and he's able to rewrite things quickly on set if things aren't working. Or, in the case of Aguirre, if you lose a bunch of pages because a guy vomits all over your typewriter. Werner originally envisioned the film with John Okello as the titular Aguirre, but since he had just gotten Idi Amin'd, that wasn't happening. But the second he stood there with the finished screenplay in his hand, he knew exactly who to call.
Die nicht zu dem Gesindel gehören, schmeißen die anderen raus, oder sie haben ihr Geld umsonst bezahlt.
Da Sie doch an sich doch auch nur angestellt sind von Ihrer verfluchten Firma da.
Moi, je fais une fatigue de venir ici, tu comprends? Jette-le dehors, finis cette conférence de presse, merde!
So what had Klaus Kinski been up to after getting kicked out of the boarding house? Well, Kinski had made a bit of a name for himself in his local country of Germany. In the 50s, he spent most of his time as a stage actor, where he quickly earned a reputation for both being a brilliant performer and for being a rabid psychopath.
I'm not doing this! Kim! Take another one, that's
Kinski was insanely prolific, starring in dozens of plays, spoken word albums, and monologue tours, like his famous Jesus Christ tour, which got cancelled midway through because the audience kept baiting him into raging at them.
Was weißt denn du von Gott?
In the 60s and 70s, Kinski starred in over 100 films, and he was very good. Despite his bouts of insanity, Kinski was a tremendous actor, receiving offers from Spielberg, Kurosawa, and Fellini, all of which he turned down. One of those offers was for a role in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which Kinski called a yawn-making, boring pile of shit. Didn't have anything against codename Wild Geese, though.
Go on, tell me all about it.
It's all on your friend Khan's computer disk.
Is it now?
It took me a while, but I put things together. You interested?
Certainly, Robin. I'll give you 1 minute for your last cigarette.
Yeah, Kinski starred in a lot of schlock. Not always. He had some good roles in westerns and whatnot, but for the most part, he did a lot of mediocre to terrible films. As an actor, he tended to follow the money. And by 1971, Kinski was rich and even decently respected, but he struggled to live up to his true potential. That was until he received a letter from his old neighbor.
For Aguirre, I simply sent him a screenplay and I wrote him a letter. I think you are the only man who could play this.
And at 2 in the morning, I get a phone call, and I couldn't figure out what the hell is going on. There were unarticulate screams for 20 minutes on the other end of the line. And somehow I figured out this must be Kinski. He says that's the best screenplay he's ever seen in his life.
In fact, Kinski was so flabbergasted to be offered a screenplay that good that he agreed to join at a much lower rate than normal. That being said, he was by no means cheap, and out of the measly $370,000 budget, around 1/3 of that went to paying Kinski. On top of that, Werner was infatuated with the idea of filming on location in the Peruvian jungle, which is an insane thing to attempt on a $370,000 budget. That's like one step above Blair Witch money. Even if you cut every corner possible, making a historical epic in the Peruvian jungle on that kind of budget is just not feasible. Filming in the jungle hundreds of miles away from civilization also meant a massively elevated risk to the crew.
When you think of going into the jungles of Peru and going into
Which is not a risk. Any idiot can do it without being harmed.
Werner's talking out of his ass here. In reality, he went out of his way to find risky-looking rapids to film in that just might be safe enough to send a manned raft through. Might being the operative word.
I was very fascinated by these raging waters of Urubamba River. It's just right down below Machu Picchu. And I filmed it, and I asked the cinematographer, hold the shot. This is so violent. This is so incredible. And
according to Peter Berling, who played Don Fernando de Guzman in the movie, we were conscious of the danger if the rafts wouldn't survive the ride. Before we passed on the rafts, Herzog had sent 2 llamas down on a canoe. The boat smashed and the llamas drowned miserably. Filming on a jungle river is also just one of the most inconvenient places to shoot a movie, especially if all you have is a single camera and a dude to hold it. Like, imagine where the cameraman has to be for these shots. The only way to film these shots of the raft is to follow the raft with a speedboat or have another raft of your own. There's no place to put a tripod or anything, so the entire film is shot using a single handheld camera. The same camera that Werner elegantly expropriated from the Munich Film School, actually. But the thing about having such a meager budget is that you don't really have enough money to fake shots. Everything you see in this movie is real. When they're braving the crazy rapids, that's for real. That shot in the beginning with the massively steep mountains is real. When they're steering the raft into a backwash, all of it's done for real. Now, they had some security measures in place. For a lot of the riskier scenes in particular, the actors are tied to the raft with cables to their wrists, which, if you fall off the raft, that might save you, but if the raft itself fails, well, hope you guys had life insurance.
Ich bin niemand, ich hasse das so, Lebensversicherungen, das ruiniert so viel von dieser Zivilisation, dass alles eben abgesichert ist.
Herzog claims that when he built his first camp near Rio Urubamba, it was for 450 people. Again, I don't know how he could afford that. I imagine the German actors were paid very little, Kinski notwithstanding. As for the hundreds of native extras, well, Herzog claims they were well paid compared to what they usually earned, so yeah, he probably paid them even less. But even then, it wasn't enough to make things run smoothly. Werner says that they often went hungry, claiming that at one point he had traded his wristwatch and boots in exchange for breakfast. Oftentimes, they had to scavenge food on their own.
I remember one night we paddled out and met at a bend in the river. None of the three of us had managed to find anything. At 4 a.m, we tied our canoes together and drifted downstream and cried.
Though the person who probably took to the situation the worst was Kinski.
Schrei ich oder schrei ich nicht? Und du sagst es mir nicht, aber ich schrei aber nicht. Leg mich doch am Arsch!
Klaus Kinski might be the most difficult man in the world to film with.
Kinski liked to position himself as a natural man. That illusion lasted for a total of maybe 5 minutes before his tent got wet from the rain and he flew into a rage. Then Werner had him build a thatch roof to shield his tent from the rain. But guess what? They're in the jungle. It's humid as hell. And within a few hours, his tent was soaked anyway. And so, he raged. So they got him a room at the only hotel in Machu Picchu, constantly bribing the hotel owner to let him stay, as his daily outbursts disturbed the other guests.
Every grey hair on my head I call Kinski.
Kinski hated the jungle, he hated the film, but most of all, he hated Herzog. Herzog and Kinski would fight on set every day.
Das hier ist ein Tonband, das wir heimlich aufgenommen haben während der Dreharbeiten zu Aguirre. Das heißt,
Das ist eine Szene! Sie sind kein Regisseur! Sie müssen bei mir lernen!
Nein, natürlich lerne ich nicht.
Sie sind ein Anfänger!
Natürlich bin ich
Ein Zwergenregisseur sind Sie, aber nicht ein Regisseur für mich!
At the beginning of the shoot, Kinski had brought along a Winchester rifle, which he carried with him wherever he went.
He had a hut a little bit higher than the extras, and the extras, 40 or 45 of them, are laughing in this hut after shooting. And Kinski throws a tantrum, these pigs are laughing! And all of a sudden, nobody knew what got into him. He fired 3 shots through the hut, through the walls. That he didn't kill anyone was a miracle. He only shot the middle finger away from one of the extras.
His rifle was then confiscated. The feud between Kinski and Herzog got so bad that at one point, Kinski tried to quit the production entirely.
if he left that moment, I would harvest him, I told him. And I told him I had a rifle with 9 bullets. Before he would reach a bend of the next river, he would have 8 bullets through his head, and the last would be for me. The man has instincts, and he understood that it was not a joke. And I told him I had time enough, a year to deliberate. My mind was made up. I told him it doesn't take me 10 seconds of deliberations. I would just do it. And he got scared and he screamed for police. But there was no police post for the next 400 miles around. But
the whole shooting schedule eventually became based around Kinski's tantrums. According to Werner, he would wait for Kinski to begin one of his signature ragers, then after 45 minutes or so, after he had thoroughly tired himself out, then they'd shoot.
I provoked him that day into a screaming, a real tantrum, and then after 1.5 hours of screaming at me and yelling at me and abusing me, he was kind of mellow and quiet and reduced and dangerous.
The biggest production setback, however, did not happen on set, but hundreds of miles away.
And the worst of all cases was Aguirre, the Wrath of God, where all the exposed negative had disappeared and was lost. It was a real drama and a real tragedy because we kept shooting without telling anyone.
If the negatives didn't show up, they were completely boned. The rights to show the movie had already been sold to a television company, the advance money had been spent, and they had no completion insurance.
Do you have E&O insurance? Do you have a completion bond? No, I don't.
By some miracle, they find the negatives just sitting in a field at Lima Airport. So they discreetly break their way in and collect the film, transporting it safely to their editing bay in Mexico. Since Aguirre was to premiere on television the same day it was set to premiere in theaters, it was dead on arrival in terms of the box office. Critically, the reception was somehow even worse.
And in Germany at that time we had some sort of a rating system. It was a panel of a jury which decided whether the film was culturally valuable or even particularly valuable. Out of 62 films or so, only 3 films didn't get it. 2 of them were too hardcore which didn't get it, and the third one was unique because it was Aguirre.
However, the movie found life outside of Germany, and today it's one of Werner's most popular and celebrated films, with many considering it one of Herzog's best, including me. Not one to rest on his laurels, Werner started work on his next feature immediately, though it wouldn't take long for tragedy to visit his life once more. In 1974, Werner's mentor, 78-year-old Lotte Eisner, suffered a massive stroke. It was deemed unlikely that she would ever recover.
And I looked at train schedules and flight schedules, and then I said, no. I'm coming on foot almost 1,000 kilometers, and I will not allow her to die.
Werner got the idea that if he walked on foot from Munich to Paris, somehow that would keep her alive. When I'm in Paris, she will be alive. She must not die. Later, perhaps, when we allow it. And so, Werner sets off with just a bag of clothes, a compass, a map, a canteen, and his wallet. He leaves from Munich in November. It's late in the autumn, and the rain is only a few degrees above freezing, and it never seems to stop. Now and then, I turn my jacket pockets inside out, wringing out the water as I would from a wet towel.
I didn't have a tent or anything, so I had to either speak to people and ask them to give me shelter, or I would break into holiday homes or into a parked camping trailer.
He would sleep under bridges, in churches, in barns, on piles of hay. He would break into sheds or holiday homes by picking the locks and carefully inviting himself in. Failing that, he could always break a window and let himself in that way. While inside, he would occasionally help himself to some of the amenities. Sometimes he'd solve a half-finished crossword puzzle lying on the coffee table. Other times, he might go into the wine cellar and grab himself a bottle or two. Though on the road, he mainly consumes 2 things: milk and tangerines. The turnover of liquids is very high. Today, 2 quarts of milk, a pound of tangerines, and shortly thereafter I was so thirsty again that my spittle was sticky, thick, and white as snow. When I approach people, I wipe the corners of my mouth because I have a feeling that there's foam on them. When he's too far away from shops, he's left foraging fatigued, unharvested vegetables lying on the side of the road, or sour, leftover apples still clinging to their tree in the early winter. Come December, the rain gives way for snow and hail. Oh, it's such a hard march as the wind bearing burning snow blows bitingly into my face, completely horizontal. And most of the time, it's all uphill, though downhill, everything hurts as well. Blisters on the balls of my toe give me trouble. Had no idea that walking could hurt so much. By the time he reaches Paris, he has barely spoken a word in 3 weeks, and he's struggling to remember how to pitch his voice for normal conversation. He limps his way to Lotte Eisner's apartment. She's home, and alive. Werner collapses in an armchair, completely spent. He says the only words that come to mind.
Together, I said, we shall boil fire and stop fish.
4 years later, the journal he made from this trip would be published as the book of Walking in Ice. To this day, Werner considers it one of his crowning artistic achievements.
Of Walking in Ice, which I published in the 70s, has never gone out of print, and it has had one edition after the other.
But of course, films continued to be his bread and butter, and his next film in particular would prove to draw significant attention. The year is 1828. A teenage boy is staggering through the streets of Nuremberg. In his hand, he has a letter, addressed to the captain of the 4th Squadron of the Schmollischer Regiment. The letter is written by a poor laborer who claims to have taken care of the boy for the last 16 years. It states that the boy's name is Kaspar Hauser, he has been raised as a Christian, has been taught to read and write, and he has never once been allowed to leave the house. The letter ends telling the captain to do whatever he wanted with the boy, either take him in or hang him. Kaspar had been raised in total isolation all his life, and subsequently had the mental development of a 3-year-old child. He could barely walk or talk, and he had a limited grasp of object permanence. Allegedly, he kept feeding his toy horse hay, thinking it was alive. Kaspar Hauser is a fairly well-known figure in German history. Like Werner, Kaspar was originally from Bavaria, and it was a story that he had no doubt been exposed to since childhood. But the question was, if he was going to tackle the story, who could he possibly get to play the character of Kaspar Hauser?
I had no idea how I would cast this film. It would be very difficult, I knew it, and I was lucky enough that only 2 or 3 days after I wrote the screenplay, I saw a film by a young German film student, filmmaker Lutz Eisholz, and it was on street singers. Among them was Bruno, and I immediately knew that was the man.
Bruno Schleinstein, often stylized as Bruno S for anonymity, was born in 1932, and just like Kaspar, his childhood was incredibly tragic.
He was the illegitimate child of a prostitute who didn't want that child, beat him from tiny on, and when he was 3 she beat him so bad that he lost speech, and she put him away into a home for retarded and insane children. And he grew up like this, started to escape, was captured, put into more and more severe institutions and correctionals.
When Bruno was released at age 26, he had spent the past 23 years in some sort of institution. Kaspar and Bruno both grew up in near total isolation from the outside world, and this parallel between them makes for an incredibly authentic performance in the movie. Except, instead of being 16 years old, Bruno is a middle-aged man. But he looks like a 16-year-old, god damn it. However, working with Bruno was not without its problems. The most immediate one being that Bruno was not a professional actor. He was a forklift driver in a steel factory. This lack of experience meant that the scenes featuring him would, on average, take twice as long to shoot as normal. Werner also had him speak with a high German dialect throughout the film, something Bruno was not accustomed to, which is why his speech pattern in the movie is so forced and stilted.
Wenn ich mich in dem Raum umsehe.
Werner really liked working with Bruno, though he was undoubtedly a troubled guy, which left him with a lot of odd personality quirks. For one, Bruno would always refer to himself in third person, referring to himself as Der Bruno, or The Bruno. He would also bring the shooting to a halt to go on hour-long rants about his life, like how the bank was trying to steal his money, or how he's forklift certified and still can't get a girlfriend. When this happened, Werner demanded that everyone stop what they were doing and listened to Bruno.
Whenever Bruno had any of his moments, or sometimes I would drag out for 2, 3, 4 hours, I asked the whole crew, stay where you are, make eye contact, listen. And I realized, because a sound guy all of a sudden after half an hour started to thumb through a magazine, and I said to him, this must not happen again. You are being paid for being here, and the real necessity is that all of us, we have to listen to Bruno. That's what we are here for now.
Bruno himself was very fond of the movie and identified heavily with the character of Kaspar Hauser. He liked the role so much that he refused to take his costume off, and most of the time he even slept in it.
One day Bruno was late for breakfast, he overslept. So I softly knocked at his hotel room at the door. There was no answer, and the door was somehow not locked, and I pushed it open, and I sensed that I pushed it against Bruno, and he shoots up, stands bolt right up there, wide awake, and he says, yes, Werner, what is it? So what happened is he had slept fully dressed, never in his bed, always next to the exit. Where could he flee fastest? So if police came wanting to arrest him, he would be out in 2 seconds, flat.
There is a silver lining to this, however. After the film came out, Bruno had gone from being treated like an outcast at the steel factory to being welcomed with open arms.
People in the street in Berlin recognized him, and they dragged him in the pastry shop, and the pastry baker gave him the best piece of cake, and the barber next door gave him a haircut for free.
In fact, Werner was enjoying making movies with Bruno so much that he decided to do another movie with him right away, Wojciech. Though after finishing the screenplay, he realized that he couldn't do it. Wojciech would have to go to Kinski.
Finally, I had some afterthoughts, and I said to Bruno, I think it would be a massive mistake if you would be cast as Wojciech. I want to do it with Kinski. And it was very disappointing for him, and he had booked his vacations already and some unpaid weeks of vacation in addition. And he said to me, what am I gonna do? And it was so embarrassing for me. It was so bad that I said to him, Bruno, we'll do another film. And he said, what is it gonna be? And I said, Bruno, I'm gonna write a screenplay quickly. By Saturday, you have it.
So Werner hauled ass and wrote a new screenplay in just 3 days. The name of the film was Stroszek.
Die Not kommt rein. Sein Geld, das hat ganz versoffen beim Schnaps und auch beim Bier. Prost, Prost, Prost.
Stroszek is about Bruno Stroszek, a German ex-con troubadour who lives with his prostitute gal pal Eva in the city of Berlin. After having zero prospects in Germany and getting manhandled by the local pimp, they decide to try their luck in the land of the free. Though when they arrive, they discover that the American dream isn't all that it's cracked up to be. First of all, Bruno is so good in this one. It definitely helps that the role of Bruno Stroszek is written to be very close to the actual Bruno. And I don't know how much of it is real acting and how much of it is just Bruno being Bruno, but I don't care. I could watch him all day.
Wenn das Gericht Sie noch einmal wegen eines Delikts verurteilt, bitte Bruno sei ruhig. Bitte Bruno sei mal ruhig.
Stroszek is another one of my favorites. I love the deliciously grim take on Americana. It's like peeking into the world that every single Tom Waits song takes place in. The parts of the movie that are shot in New York might be the most gonzo filming that Werner's ever done. Werner has zero filming permits anywhere, so they have to covertly sneak the camera into places, film the scene as fast as they can, and then get the hell out of Dodge. The most insane shot in this movie is actually a rather innocuous one. It's just the shot of them driving. This is such a mundane shot that you don't even really think about it. But what's happening here is that they are driving an actual car on an actual New York highway, and Werner Herzog is fucking strapped to the hood of the car.
We were arrested 3 times within an hour because Thomas Mauch and I were just strapped with some belts to the hood and were filming it. Of course, that was something the cops didn't like at all, and I was handcuffed that day twice. We always got away. I said, yeah, we are, we looked very young at that time, and I said, we are these crazy crowds, these film students, and so the cops let us get away with it. And the same one caught us half an hour later. We were still at it.
Call me crazy, but couldn't you have just strapped the camera to the car? Why did you strap your whole ass German body to the car? Just to hold the camera? Later in the movie, Bruno and Eva eventually get to the state of Wisconsin, where they end up settling in a place called Railroad Flats.
This is the reason why we named it the Railroad Flats, of all the freight trains that we have here.
In reality, the town is called Plainfield, and is first and foremost known for being the serial killer capital of the US. Werner actually discovered this place years earlier while talking to his friend Errol Morris, who was researching serial killers at the time, and in particular, Ed Gein.
And my friend Errol Morris was planning to write a big book on Plainfield, had spent months there. He was pondering over the question, why had Ed Gein not only murdered people but also excavated freshly buried bodies? He had found out that there was a perfect circle of graves that Ed Gein had excavated. In the very center was the grave of his mother, and he wondered over the question, has he also excavated his own mother?
So Werner and Errol Morris make a plan to go to Plainfield, Wisconsin and dig up Ed Gein's mom.
Shouldn't we do it together? I said, yeah, in a few months I'm traveling to Alaska. I can make a stopover.
Yes, I can make a stop. It's like he's picking up Starbucks on the way to work. But Werner is nothing if not true to his word. And as he stood there, shovel in hand, he discovered that Earl had chickened out. But he ended up falling in love with Plainfield, Wisconsin, both for its its beautiful landscapes and its lovely people.
You sense that from this part of the country, all the best people of America come, not only the mass murderers.
I'm gonna spoil this 50-year-old movie for a minute and talk about the ending. Bruno is stuck in the town of Cherokee, North Carolina, in the middle of absolute nowhere. He's just lost his girlfriend, lost his house, lost his car. His friend just got arrested after they robbed a bank together. So Bruno decides to spend his last quarters in a shabby penny arcade, activating every machine at once. The star of the show here is the dancing chicken. The infinitely dancing chicken is just pure kino. It's just such a fun and unique image that could only exist in a Werner Herzog production. Because it's one thing to have the idea in the first place, it's another thing to put in the months, yes, months of work in order to actually bring it to life.
I actually had the chicken in special training with this music in their winter quarter for about 3 months.
This is like the 3rd or 4th movie in which Werner hypnotizes a chicken. He really has it out for them.
You have to do yourself a favor when you're out in the countryside and you see chicken. Try to look a chicken in the eye with great intensity, and the intensity of stupidity that is looking back at you is just amazing.
Overall, the shooting of Stroszek went according to plan. Werner was able to get the shots he needed, and Bruno was free to return to his job at the steel mill. But as Werner is in the process of editing the movie, he reads something very interesting in the newspaper.
French authorities ordered the evacuation of 72,000 people living in the area around La Soufrière volcano today after experts said that it could erupt within hours. We have begun what we think is the countdown. The volcano cannot turn back. We think an eruption is coming, perhaps the most significant one in the Caribbean during this century.
The entirety of southern Guadeloupe had been evacuated, except for one man who chose to stay behind.
And I had the feeling I should go there and film with him because he must have had a different attitude towards death.
Werner left for the Caribbean the same day.
Things began to take a dramatic turn towards the end of August. What was expected was no ordinary eruption, but an explosion of the whole volcano with a force of at least 5 or 6 atomic bombs.
La Soufrière is a short film about the inevitable eruption of the volcano of the same name. The film starts with Werner and the crew exploring the completely empty town of Basse-Terre. It is completely silent. Not even the animals have stuck around.
It's jungle overgrown and all birds had disappeared. First thing you notice in a jungle are the voices of birds. Second, all the snakes had fled and gone out into the ocean and drowned and had been washed back on shore.
The French authorities had barricaded the roads leading up to the volcano, but clinically sane director Werner Herzog finds an alternate way to the top. But once they start approaching the summit, the camera guys start getting cold feet.
And he came back and he asked me, what is going to happen if that mountain explodes and we are there? I said to him, Edward, we will be airborne.
Thankfully though, the volcano doesn't explode while they're standing there. They get some good shots of the crater, Werner pisses in it for good measure, and then they climb down again to talk with a local farmer who refused to evacuate the island. Now it turns out that there were 3 guys who stuck around on the island, not just one. And, as promised, Werner tracks them down to ask them some questions. I think Werner might have expected them to have some revelatory insight into life and death, but when he asks them why they're staying behind, their answers basically boil down to, it is what it is.
But the situation is very dangerous, isn't it? Sure it is, of course it's dangerous. But I'm staying here. What difference does it make?
There had been a volcanic explosion before on the nearby Mount Pelly that wiped out the entire population of the town of Saint Pierre in 1902 and burnt the entire town to a crisp.
This is a meal of spaghetti burned to a cinder on a plate. And here is a loaf of bread.
The reason the 1902 eruption was so bad was that the volcano didn't simply erupt, it exploded, creating a massive cloud of poison gas, hot ash, and volcanic debris that incinerated anything it came into contact with. And this eruption was looking to be even more devastating than that. which sort of highlights how ridiculous this movie really is, because all geological signs point to the volcano blowing up any second, and if they are on that part of the island when that happens, they're dead. Werner has a wife and kids at this point too. Like, at this point in his life, he has a lot more to lose, but once again, he lucks out.
The volcano did not explode.
While it might be a bit of an anticlimactic conclusion for the movie, it does mean that Werner escapes the island with his life intact, ready to make his next film.
Ich heiße Martin und ich bin immer allein in meiner Höhle.
In 1976, Werner made the short film No One Will Play With Me at a school for problem children in Munich. Here's what Werner has to say about this one. Then I made a documentary short called No One Will Play With Me. It's not that important. Alright, moving on. Heart of Glass is about a town in Bavaria famous for its crimson-colored glass called ruby glass. But the last guy who knew the recipe just died, and the town is scrambling to find it again. Now that description tells you practically nothing about Heart of Glass. It's an incredibly poetically dense movie, to the point where it's practically incomprehensible. Everyone talks like they've just popped Ambien, and nothing they say is gonna make any sense until your third or fourth rewatch. This combination of both being incredibly slow and difficult to understand makes this film a tough one to get into, especially if you're a cinema plebeian like me. Visually though, this film is strikingly beautiful. Every scene is beautifully lit and looks like a 200-year-old oil painting. These are some of Werner Herzog's best landscapes, period. But the thing the movie is most remembered for today is that everyone in this movie is acting under hypnosis. Early on in the film, there is a prophecy outlining a coming catastrophe, and Werner wanted to have the effect of everyone sort of sleepwalking into a foreseeable disaster.
The story has to do with a collective trance, like sleepwalkers. All these villages that you are gonna see, everyone is walking into a foreseen disaster.
That's when he gets the idea of hypnotizing all the actors. Now I should clarify what he means by hypnosis in this case. Hypnosis is not about mind control, nor is it about gaining total subservience from an actor. It's about invoking an alternate state of mind closer to the subconscious, making them more open to suggestion. This helps give the movie a totally unique, dreamlike vibe. All the actors look like they're staring right through each other. Werner put an ad in the local papers asking for actors who were open to performing under hypnosis, and did some tests to pick out those who were the most susceptible to being hypnotized. Originally, he had hired a professional hypnotist.
I must say, after 2 or 3 sessions, I did not like the hypnotist anymore. He was just a real idiot, and he was involved in astrology and all this kind of stupid things.
So Werner decides he has to hypnotize the actors himself. Werner claims that to this day, his voice maintains some of that hypnotist way of speaking and the timbre of his voice, which definitely checks out. These days, the hypnotism gimmick has a tendency to overshadow the film itself, and part of that is because Heart of Glass is just so dense and difficult to get into. You really need to approach it with a certain state of mind to really get the most out of it. Fittingly then, Werner himself has done screenings where he has hypnotized the audience beforehand.
And I hypnotized the audience. 15 to 20% in this audience actually had experiences that they had never ever had before in their life. Some of them thought they were floating like in a helicopter in the scenes itself, and they saw visions and very, very strange and interesting.
He was originally planning on hypnotizing the audience through the screen too.
I wanted to appear in a prologue myself on screen, talking to the audience, telling them you could experience and see this film under hypnosis. Of course, I would tell them at the end of the film I would reappear and wake you up slowly and without any anxieties and softly. And it was quite clear you can't do hypnosis in an anonymous way. It's too risky, it's too stupid.
One of the guys on the film crew, Alan Greenberg, wrote a book on how it was like working on the set with Werner, called Every Night the Trees Disappear. Now what's cool about that is that you get anecdotes from Werner's life that Werner himself tends to leave out, like the time he and his lead producer each grabbed a rifle and broke into a guy's house because he owed them money, or the time that Werner ate roadkill. Herzog hit the brakes. Then, a thump. We jumped out to find a bloody hair on the road. Herzog pondered the carcass and wondered what to do with it. Herzog, seeing that the fatal injury was a crushed skull, placed it in the van and said its meat could be salvaged for eating. Just remember to stay away from the brainworms, big guy. Werner Herzog's Nosferatu is a reimagining of the 1922 film Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror by Friedrich Murnau. The 1922 version was an unofficial adaptation of the original Dracula novel by Bram Stoker. Though since Dracula was not public domain at the time, they changed around a bunch of names and tweaked a few storylines to get around the copyright laws. It did not work, and they got sued to hell. Werner's version restores the original names of the characters from the Bram Stoker novel and makes some significant changes in how the story is presented, though the underlying plot is mostly the same. Jonathan Harker is a solicitor living in Wismar, Germany. One day he gets forwarded a letter from Count Dracula, who announces his intentions to move out of his Transylvanian castle to a quaint manor in Wismar, promising a sizable commission if they can smooth out the details.
Oh, dann könnte ich ein schöneres Haus für Lucy kaufen. Sie verdient etwas Besseres.
Determined not to fumble Isabella Gianni, Jonathan sets off on the long and winding road to Dracula's castle. But when he arrives, he discovers that Count Dracula has turned into a horrible beast, who the locals refer to as Klaus Kinski.
Ich habe Sie erwartet. Sie sind Jonathan Harker. Ja? Treten Sie ein. Die Nacht ist kalt und Sie müssen müde und hungrig sein.
In many ways, this film is Werner's love letter to German cinema. The 1922 version is one of the most important films of all time, and for Werner especially, it brings a sense of legitimacy to German film history that was lost during the Second World War.
For me, Murnau's film Nosferatu is the very best German film ever. Since I've done this film, I've always felt now, yes, I'm connected. Now I belong to a certain flow of culture, yeah.
There are some very deliberate homages to the original, with some shots being recreated one-to-one from the 1922 version, but make no mistake, this film is classic Herzog. Slow-paced, incredible landscape shots, and some light vandalism. Like the opening shot, which shows a bunch of actual mummies that Werner had to break out of a museum.
When I came back to shoot them, they were all in glass cages or on exhibit.
Right.
So we took them out and I carried them on my shoulder. They don't weigh very much because they are so dried up, something like 40 pounds or so, and it was very, very odd to do that.
As stated earlier, Werner managed to convince Klaus Kinski to play Dracula, which was a very smart play because Kinski positively murders this role. Werner says Kinski was uncharacteristically nice and easygoing during production, probably because he got to spend some time in his true form. The only problem was that someone apparently figured that Kinski was too short to properly play Dracula, so throughout the entire film he's wearing the fattest platform boots known to man. Really, the whole Dracula getup was pretty intense, taking 5 hours a day to put on. Kinski hated it, but according to Werner, he handled it remarkably well. As is Herzog tradition at this point, there are a lot of meticulously planned scenes involving real animals. You thought training a chicken to dance for 3 months was something? How about training bats for 6 months?
And these bats had to be trained. This is a real bat now, which we used. So the bats were half a year in training just to support the light and still fly around.
Though the part everyone remembers is when Count Dracula makes his way to the city of Wismar, bringing with him a scourge of thousands of rats. Now, to get these shots, Werner was planning to unleash 11,000 real rats in the small Dutch city of Delft. Understandably, this made the city council very nervous.
We secured the place completely and perfectly with nets towards the water and sealing every single crevice or hole or sewage system so that not one of them could escape. But of course there was lots of problems with the city of Delft.
Miraculously, the shoot went very well, with Werner later remarking that they didn't lose a single rat. Now, what he means by that is that they didn't lose a single rat on set. Werner knows a lot about a lot, but he doesn't know rats, so he got biologist Martin at Hart on board as the film's rat guy, a rat consultant, if you will. First of all, Werner had to import the rats. The filming was to take place in the Netherlands, and the rats had to be imported from a laboratory in Hungary. According to Hart, the travel conditions were so poor that by the time the rats had arrived on set, they had begun eating each other. Once the rats had arrived in Delft, they had another problem. The rats were all white, and Werner didn't want white rats, he wanted grey rats. So he starts designing contraptions to dye 11,000 rats as efficiently as possible. Hart, meanwhile, is telling him not to bother, as the rats are gonna lick the dye clean off. But Werner wants grey rats, damn it. So Werner goes to a hair dye factory in Munich, and the guys at the factory tell him that the easiest way to do it would be to dip their cages in a vat of hair dye for a split second. So that's what they do. But according to Hart, that hair dye was boiling hot, and Werner and the crew ended up killing literally thousands of rats in the process. And it didn't even work. In the movie, especially towards the end, you can clearly see that the hair dye is in various stages of deteriorating, with many of the rats either being completely free of the dye or exuding a weird yellowish hue. Martin at Hart said that he no longer wished to cooperate with the movie due to the way the animals were treated. Nosferatu was filmed all over Europe, and some of the countries they filmed in were hard to get shooting permits for. Czechoslovakia in particular was tricky, and he had another movie he planned to shoot there in the near future. So instead of going through the lengthy process of getting another permit, he starts shooting his next movie, Wojciech, the day after they wrap up shooting for Nosferatu. Wojciech is about Private Wojciech, a hapless recruit who's just trying to provide for his wife and child, but ends up getting stepped on by everyone in his life, both figuratively and literally, until one day he hits his breaking point.
Da. Lauter, lauter. Was sagt ihr?
Kinski once again returns to play the titular Wojciech, and he does a bang-up job as always. This is where shooting back-to-back movies ended up doing Werner a solid, because it means Kinski is way too exhausted to throw his usual tantrums, and the whole production went extremely smoothly. Wojciech was originally based on an unfinished stage play, and that stage-like feeling is preserved through a good chunk of this movie. It's almost entirely made up of 4-minute shots, with only minimal cuts in between. In fact, the whole movie was shot and edited in just 22 days, making it probably the most efficient movie Werner has ever made. Werner and Kinski were seemingly on good terms after the movie wrapped up, with Werner alleging that a lot of their perceived rivalry at this point was drummed up for the press. For example, in Kinski's autobiography, when describing Werner, Kinski claims that he's never in his life met anyone so dull, humorless, uptight, inhibited, mindless, depressing, boring, and swaggering.
But Kinski, page after page, starts to rant against me and insult me, and there's page after page.
And you were suggesting words to him, right?
Yes, I found some good ones in the dictionary.
Now, I tried to read his autobiography as research for this video, but it is unusable as a research document because it is clearly bullshit. It's so obvious that these are just the writings of an extreme narcissist who sees himself as the greatest actor in the world, whose performances move all the men to tears and all the women to his master bedroom. Like seriously, Kinski is betting a new woman every other page, going into every sexual encounter in explicit detail, and most of it is completely made up.
This whole biography, of course, much of it is made up, all his sexual exploits. Of course, there were some, but it's grossly over-exaggerated.
After Wojciech, Werner was intent on starting the pre-production of his next movie, but he was quickly distracted by a commitment he had made to an old friend. 3 years earlier, Werner had reconnected with Errol Morris in Berkeley, California. Having given up his plans of digging up Ed Gein's mom, Errol instead set his sights on making a movie about pet cemeteries in California. In response, Werner remarked that Errol never finishes anything, and if he ever manages to complete a film, he would eat his shoe. Ah, shit.
I think I'm gonna stuff some garlic into each one.
In 1979, Werner Herzog would publicly cook and eat his shoe at the restaurant Cheese Panisse in Berkeley, California. To prepare the shoe, Werner cooked it in a stock pot of duck fat and fried it for 5 hours.
Hold it way up so everybody can see it. All the way up. All the way up.
While it might have helped the taste, the heat from the duck fat caused the leather to toughen and shrink, making it difficult to cut, let alone chew. He carved off pieces with poultry shears and downed the pieces of shoe with generous gulps of German beer. So much beer, in fact, that Werner got properly sloshed, and to this day he has zero recollection of how the boot actually tasted.
What does it taste like?
I don't remember.
While today this is a significant part of the Werner mythos, Werner has his reservations about the film being released to the public at all.
Well, I don't want to elaborate much on the film because Les Blanc misled me and he said this is only for the family album, and then he published it afterwards.
But he had bigger things to worry about. Because in the background, he was working on the biggest film of his entire career. A project that would span years of his life, millions of dollars, and ultimately involve thousands of people. With a production so troubled that not only are there books about the making of this movie, not only are there other movies about the making of this movie, there are books about the movie about making this movie. But before we get to that, we have a few more to go through.
God's honor is at stake every night. This is not a show.
God's Angry Man is about televangelist Dr. Gene Scott, who had been doing nearly daily broadcasts since 1975. These broadcasts consisted of Bible studies, bland vocal quartets, and, maybe most importantly, fundraising for the faith-centered church. The original German title for this film, Faith and Currency, is probably the more fitting title. On a broader level, God's Angry Man is an insight into the mind of the televangelist preacher, and how the rise of television has given a platform for unscrupulous actors to exploit religion for personal profit. But what separates Dr. Scott from his fellow racketeers is that he's not putting on a facade. His anger is real. If he doesn't get money, he yells at his audience until they donate.
Do you understand that God's work hangs on 600 miserable dollars?
When he does get the money, he yells at them for taking too long.
200, 100, well over, after I yell at you. Why didn't you do it because you love God?
It's pretty despicable, but Werner is good at showing the complexities of the good doctor. You get the feeling that behind the curtain, Gene Scott is lonely and miserable. Despite building his whole life around printing money, he seems totally unfulfilled.
Let me tell you what makes me happy. Get me on a jet, 8,000 miles to a city where nobody knows me.
There's one point where he hits $250,000 in donations for the night, and there's zero joy in his face at all.
Wait a minute, Joe. Bring those back. We've already crossed $250,000. So let's take it right on up to 300,000. Take it right on up to 300,000.
The only part where he seems positively engaged is at the end of the film, when he starts rallying against the FCC.
Turn them all on. Give me some monkey farm, the FCC monkey band. Here's your bureaucrats. Would you like to grow up and be a bureaucrat if you're a kid watching? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oreo. 1, 2.
On the other side of the spectrum, Werner also made another short film that year called Huey's Sermon.
He worships money. He bows down to the great almighty shrinking inflated dollar.
This film is exactly what it says it is. It's a sermon by Huey. More specifically, Pastor Huey L. Rogers of the Bible Way Church of Our Lord Jesus Christ. Huey Rogers was sort of a local micro-celebrity in New York City, known for his flashy, rock star-style preaching, and that's at full display here. It starts off as a pretty standard, if enthusiastic, sermon, but by the 15-minute mark, Huey goes completely off the rails. He starts rallying about how sperm banks are being used to create a super race of humans, how solar panels are stealing power from the sun, and how artificial snow is against God's will.
When they get ready to ski and they ain't got no snow, they try to manufacture snow, but the only one that can make snow is Almighty God.
And as it goes on, Huey becomes more and more unhinged and just starts saying whatever.
He fixed the buses, and he drive the buses. What line do you used to drive on? 7th Avenue? Lord have mercy.
As a whole, Huey's sermon is kinda interesting, but if you're looking for Werner Herzog, yeah, this is the most nothing film he has ever done. He literally just shows up with the camera and hits the record button and lets Huey do his thing, with some occasional cuts to B-roll when he's changing the film in the camera. What's really crazy though is that Huey is still going today.
Somebody scream! Somebody holler!
This guy is apparently 90 years old. There's no way, dude. Maybe God is real.
Diabetes just died.
But these movies are just stocking stuffers, quickly produced short films to release something, while he worked on what would ultimately become his magnum opus, Fitzcarraldo.